Thank you. Good afternoon. I walked with Richard in the spring sunlight last year. He was on a walker, slow and steady, slow and steady. Your first year in the legislature, there's nothing more menacing than being in front of the finance committee table. And Richard would get a slow nod of his head if he liked what your pitch was to the committee. And then we had these green co-sponsor slips. And Richard was notorious for probably everybody before you. If he liked your idea, he would sign it right there while you were offering your testimony, and send it over to the table, and it would land on the table while you were offering your testimony. And there was nothing that you could do for a young guy to buttress your confidence in what you're presenting. He remains one of the most gracious people that I've had the privilege of knowing. Thanks.
Well, amongst the 60 of us in Juneau, we're all pretty much a bunch of characters, and Richard certainly stands out at the front of the class. Scott mentioned his birthday salutations that he does for each of us on our birthday if the session is in, and if your birthday is between May and January, you're in trouble. It's probably the only time that there's off-color and risque open comments and conversations on the floor. Richard's famous for it. We all appreciate it in his uniqueness, and it's something that we don't see enough of. But Richard supplied plenty of it, and we hope he continues doing that.
Richard and I started serving about the same time, in 1975 and 1976. And one of the first things I took a liking to him about was his incredible sense of humor. And he was always chosen to MC some group or another. And one of the things that you always wanted to be careful of was a lot of his humor was risque, but everybody seemed to enjoy it. Anyway, it was a great privilege to know him. Thank you.
I drew the short straw, and Joe, I guess you're last, though, right? Speaker Phillips, thank you very much for allowing us to come up and say a few words. And you know how speakers are; we don't get off the podium in 30 seconds for much of anything or much of anybody. But just two stories I want to tell about Richard. The first one is historical. My mother's side of our family came to Alaska in 1898, and if you know anything about Richard, he loves history. And he loves to go down to the libraries, and spend a fair amount of time down there going through the archives and finding out about anybody and everybody he can. And every day, just about, when he has the opportunity, he'll bring back some piece of information about some legislator's family or whatever, especially if they've been around the state for very long. And so Richard would consistently come into my office, especially when I was speaker. He'd say, "Harris, Harris, do you know something about your family?" I said, "Well, probably, but I don't know, what is it?" So he had these little tidbits, and they were pretty interesting. But anyway, that was back in the old gold rush days of Alaska. And Richard is, of course, a miner and aviator and all that sort of stuff. The last thing I want to say about Richard, I could say a lot of things, but I want to tell a little story about a former representative that represented my district, Betty Cato. And Betty was the chairman of the Transportation Committee in a coalition. I don't know if you were involved in that at that time, but maybe that was before you. Anyway, Richard was there, and Richard was a typical prankster. And I got to make sure I tell this story right, because my friend Bill Stoltz will correct me if I do it wrong, but because he's the historian in our group. But Richard loved to play pranks on people, and he especially loved to play pranks on Representative Cato, because she wore these high-heeled shoes, and she'd spike-like things, She couldn't run real fast, but she'd try. And Richard would take the head of the gavel, and, know, our gavels that we use in committee rooms and whatever. And he unscrewed the head of the gavel so it was barely hanging on there. If you know anything about Representative Cato, she loved to slam the gavel down on the wheel. It was hard for me to get everybody's attention. I had that, I occasionally would do that myself and wake some people up. But anyway, so one day he decided he was going to make this, and he unscrewed the head of the gavel, so it's just barely hanging on there. And she goes, and the head goes flying off, and she comes after chasing Richard around the room. And you know the joke is funny because even Richard was laughing about it when he's telling it. So anyway, thank you all very much, and I'll see if I can get this back up here.
I think that the stories you just heard really give a sense of the kind of leadership skills that UAF can teach, and that a person like, including the risque piece, I think as well. Richard really has a unique presence in Juneau. Any of us who go down, he is such a historian, wanting to make sure that he's collected the signatures of every legislator who's been there, really understanding the history of the House and the Senate. Very important to him that we capture that and that we hold on to it. As a member of Fossils, which some of us, a couple of us are here, that's the former old senior statesman in legislative service. The Fossils, Richard has helped capture some of the history of the Fossils as well, and we appreciate it, all of us who served in the legislature with him or who served before or after. Or after he came in. So again, thanks to all the legislators who came up here to recognize Richard. Sorry he can't be here. We look forward to seeing him back in Juneau in January.